Hello and welcome. Today we are beginning our study of the book of Revelation with this introduction video. Now, if I'm being honest, I haven't always had the greatest relationship with the book of Revelation. Partly because when I was growing up in the Christian culture, particularly in my Christian school that I went to, teachers would talk a lot about the end times in a way that was very scary, and we felt very afraid. And they would talk about, the rapture and the tribulation and these plagues, and they would show us these movies from the 70s. I think they were called Thief in the Night, and they were they were pretty scary. And so I didn't always have the greatest impression. And then you have all these fantastical images like demons and beasts, and then as I was a young adult, I would notice a lot of Christians that would always want to talk about the end times, and they're reading this prophecy book and this prophecy book and this prophecy book and trying to understand it all and get it all down in charts. And then there's the people who are watching the news and always saying, oh, this is a sign of the times, this is a sign of the times, this is a sign of the times. And that's really complicated when you start doing that, because throughout history, people have been doing that. And a lot of the things that they said were the representations, or there was something that was symbolized in the book of Revelation, turned out to not be that. I think many people have been called the Antichrist over the course of history. And, well, it's not to say that those people or those situations weren't bad, but we just have to be very careful because they've been wrong many times. And you think of books that were written in the 80s that were talking all about how these things happening were just signs of the end time was happening now, and it didn't happen. So that's not really the approach we need to take as we look at the book of Revelation. And so what I'd like to ask us to do is to step back and to try to take the book of Revelation for what it is itself and what it's trying to be. Let's start off by talking about the author. In verse 1, it says that the author was John. It doesn't say anything else, just John. And because the book was accepted, we generally would say it's the Apostle John, because he was already a respected figure, an apostle. But also the early Christians from the 2nd century, 3rd century, they also affirmed that it came from John the Apostle. People like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, they all said that it was John. And even though people might come up with some arguments saying that some of the writing doesn't quite match other books of John, in general, scholars tend to believe that it comes from John. When was it written? Well, there's different theories on that, but most scholars are convinced that it was written later, probably in about the year 95 or 96 AD, more or less, which would make it the last book of the New Testament to be written. So you actually have the last book of the Bible was the last book written. And it was probably written during the time that Domitian was the emperor of the Roman Empire. And that makes a lot of sense because things were very difficult for Christians under the reign of Domitian. Domitian, he proclaimed himself to be God. In fact, he wanted people to use the title for him, our Lord and our God. I don't know if you've ever heard a title like that. It sounds biblical. So he expected worship from his people, from the Roman citizens and the people in the empire, and they were generally okay with worshiping the emperor. It was part of kind of the Roman way, but some people like Domitian took it way more seriously than others. Most Roman emperors thought that they might be considered a god after they were alive, but he considered himself to be a living god, and he expected worship. I would like to point out that Jews actually had a special carve-out exception made for them in the Roman Empire, that they did not have to participate in the emperor worship or the emperor cult. And the reason for that is because the Romans saw Jews as being a separate race, a certain ancient race, an ancient people group with an ancient religion, which was monotheistic, and they thought that was strange, but that's just the way Jews are, and that's who they are, that's who they've been for 1,000 years or more, and so that's just the way they are. We don't worry about it. And they really had a carve out in the Roman Empire that they didn't have to participate in certain things because of their ethnicity. However, Christians, so maybe Christian Jews might not have been persecuted, whereas non-Jewish Christians would have been. Now, Domitian, he makes sense, and I would like to point out that Irenaeus, who was a church father from the late 2nd century, he said that the book of Revelation took place not long ago, but almost in our generation near the end of Domitian's reign. So that gives us kind of an idea. And why should we listen to Irenaeus? Well, Irenaeus, as I said, he's the late 2nd century, so the late 1st century is when it was written, so about 100 years later, more or less. But Irenaeus had been discipled by a man named Polycarp. Polycarp was also one of the church fathers, and Polycarp had been discipled by John, the apostle. So Irenaeus is someone that when he says some of these things, you should listen, because you can actually trace him 2 discipleship generations away from John himself. So I think he knew a fair amount about it. Now it says in verse 9 of chapter 1 that John was on the island of Patmos when he received this revelation and when he wrote the book. So Patmos is an island off the coast of Turkey. And that area, that region of Turkey right there along the Mediterranean is what's known as the region of Asia. So when Paul in Acts, or Luke in Acts, talks about Paul traveling through Asia, or Paul saying about the Asian churches, that's where they're talking about. They're talking about that region of Turkey that's right along the coast of the Mediterranean. And so this book was written to 7 churches that are all in that region. And as you read through the book of Revelation, these churches are addressed in the order that a traveler would visit them along the Roman highway system if they left from Patmos. So John wrote on Patmos. He sent this letter to 7 churches. He addressed it in the order that the person carrying them would visit them if he had left from Patmos. So that's kind of interesting, and they kind of form a little circular pattern of where these cities are. But I want to make that clear that Revelation was written to real churches in real places facing real problems. So as we look at Revelation, all the symbols and all the questions, we have to recognize that he's writing to these people in their context, in their place where they live. And so that's important. He wasn't writing to us, and so maybe they'll have a different perspective on what he's saying than we would. And John actually expects that they will listen to the prophecy and obey. It says that. It says that they would obey the words of the prophecy. And so that would lead us to believe that if they're going to obey, they have the ability to understand what he's talking about. So while it might be hard for us, it seems like it was understandable to them, to a place where they would be able to understand and obey. So what was going on? As I said, under the time of Domitian, there was persecution. So the churches were facing a time of persecution. And John writes the book of Revelation to these churches for 2 reasons. The first is to encourage them as they face persecution. And the second is to warn them against compromising with the world in order to escape persecution. Because that's a very human thing to say, you know what, I'm gonna tone it down. I'm gonna be quiet because I don't want to bring persecution on myself. And he is warning them, don't compromise with the world. So, encouragement in persecution and a warning against compromise. Now, whenever we're reading a book or a work of literature, we need to know what type of book it is so that we can interpret it correctly. For instance, if I'm reading a recipe book, I know that I'm reading a recipe book and it's for cooking, right? And I wouldn't read a fantasy book as a recipe for cooking. So you have to know what you are reading. And so the word literal comes from literary, literature, writing, and that means that for something to be understood literally is that you have to understand what type of literature it is. And Revelation, if we're going to call it something, would be a prophetic, apocalyptic letter. Prophetic, apocalyptic letter. First, I'll just say it's a letter. We said that he addressed it to 7 churches, and it was taken and it was read to them, and they were expected to think about it, understand it, and obey. It was a letter. Also, it was prophetic. It was prophetic in 2 senses. In one sense, because it's declaring God's truth, which we would call forthtelling, and it's talking about things that are coming in the future, which is a form of foretelling. And then it's also apocalyptic. Now, that is a word that we don't understand, and in fact, Hollywood would give us the wrong impression, because Hollywood would make us think that the apocalypse means the end times. Well, they're actually getting that definition from the sense that the book of Revelation talks about the end times. But apocalypse does not mean the end times. What apocalypse means is the revelation or the unveiling of a truth that isn't necessarily seen so directly. And so the Bible has other apocalyptic writings, for instance, in Daniel and Zechariah, where you have these visions and these things that are showing you what the reality is that people aren't seeing. It's unveiling the true reality. So apocalypse means an unveiling or a revelation. So let's talk about how we should interpret the book of Revelation. And there are a variety of approaches that I'm not going to get into, but there's, the historical approach, the idealist approach, the preterist approach. It's you can look that up if you want to. But most scholars would say that you need kind of a mixed, kind of a balanced approach, because being that it's a letter, there are things that John is talking directly to the context of those people in their situation where they can understand. And so some of the things that he talks about were happening back then. And some of the things that he said were coming soon actually were happening during that time. So you have to look at those passages accordingly. But then there are other passages in Revelation that talk about the end of all time, and we're not there yet. So we have to look carefully at what we're reading and say, is this something that was talking about what was happening then, or is this something that's talking about what's happening in the future? And that can be difficult. But the commentaries that I was reading propose that learning about history will give us a better understanding of the book of Revelation, much more so than looking at current events to try to understand the book of Revelation. And besides, it's kind of arrogant in a way to say that the people back then couldn't have any idea what it was saying because these things hadn't happened yet. Seems like a really arrogant position. And so it kind of takes a balanced approach. Some people call it an eclectic approach. But you're going to have to see that some things that you see in the book of Revelation already happened. And some things are still to happen. And so, as we look, there are things from current events that most people would agree this has prophetic significance. For instance, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Most biblical scholars would say that event has prophetic significance. But what the President of the United States said today about this and this, probably not. So we just have to be very careful and balanced as we look at the book of Revelation and try not to make it say something that we want it to say, but rather listen to what it is saying. And that brings me to the idea of symbols. The book is full of symbols. Our problem is that we don't use the same symbols anymore that they used or they understood. And so they would have understood the symbols much easier than we do looking at them. So a symbol is something that a community understands represents something else. So for instance, a logo. If you see the logo like a swoosh, you know that that symbol represents Nike. And so these symbols that are in the book actually represent a truth. And so the symbol itself is nothing. It's a representation of a bigger truth. And so these things that we're reading about, these symbols, are supposed to be showing us a bigger truth. And so there are images, there are numbers, and all kinds of different symbols that we're going to have to work through as we look at the book of Revelation. And just one more thing about symbols is that I would like to say that John used symbols to teach a truth, not to create a puzzle or a mystery. They were there so that they could understand. He was communicating something in a way that could be understood. He wasn't creating a puzzle for us to solve. So if you're looking at the book of Revelation and you're thinking of it as a puzzle, trying to understand the whole schema or outline or scheme of the end times, you're missing the point. Because that's not what John was trying to do with this book. It's not what he was trying to communicate. So I would say if you are looking at Revelation as a puzzle to solve, you're completely missing the point. And if you want to know what the point of the book of Revelation is, it's written in the very first sentence of the book. A revelation of Jesus Christ. The point of Revelation is to unveil the truth of who Jesus is. He is not just a man who was here on the earth, who died and rose again. No, he is the creator. He is God. He is the Lord of all eternity. He is the Lord of all the earth. He is the one who is sovereign. He is the true our Lord and our God. And so Revelation actually proclaims Jesus as the Lord more directly, more explicitly, and more often than most of the books in the New Testament, because it's trying to tell you this is who Jesus is. Who is the eternal Christ? Not just the Jesus that was on the earth for 33 years, but Jesus that's standing at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Who is he? That's the vision he wants to give us. That's the revelation he wants us to have, is who is Jesus really? And so when we are faced with difficult times, when we're faced with persecution, we need to focus on who Jesus is as the Lord of heaven and earth. And maybe persecution should intensify our witness. Maybe it should make us more focused rather than weakening us or making us fearful. So I'd just like to conclude by listing a few themes or ideas that we see throughout the book. God is sovereign and majestic. Jesus' sacrifice brings ultimate deliverance to his people. God will judge the world and avenge his people. Sin will not go unpunished. God accomplishes his purpose through people, even if they're weak. God has a purpose for us, even if we're weak, even if we are being persecuted. When we worship God in suffering, it leads us to turn our grief into hope. Proclaiming Jesus invites persecution. Persecution is a normal state for the church. But you know what? Christ is worth suffering for. Christ is worth dying for. And the book of Revelation proclaims the differences between what it looks like in God's kingdom and what it looks like in the world. And it calls for us to live according to God's kingdom and not to compromise with the world. And the hope of glory that we have with Christ far outweighs any suffering that we might be dealing with now. And finally, we see a picture of what is coming, a new heaven and a new earth, and we see that the bride, his church, is made up of people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And so it's not just about Jews. Salvation came through the Jews, but it is for all people everywhere. All right. I hope this introduction is helpful to you as we begin studying. I'll be having to make another video on chapter 1 later this week. God bless you. Have a great day.